Welcome to the Soft Skills Salon, your audible think tank on soft skills. I remain your host, Diana Kowarski, president of the Soft Skills Group. Hello. And we're delighted to be sharing time with Ilana Ben-Ari, who is a toy designer turned social entrepreneur. She is the founder of 21 Toys and the inventor of the Failure Toy and Empathy Toy, the award-winning facilitation tools used in thousands of boardrooms and classrooms in over 50 countries. Featured in Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 female founders of 2020, her inventions have been praised in Time magazine as a technology that is reshaping the future of learning. I can also attest, as someone who has both gone through some training at 21 Toys forever ago to use your empathy toy, and as I proclaimed prior to we hit record, I have been failing at introducing the failure toy, but I am a big fan. So, hello, Ilana.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
It's delightful to have you here. And thank you very much for making the time and for sharing that time with us. I am certain this is going to be a great conversation. So, in and around soft skills, we can have a lot of debates around what exactly soft skills are, sometimes referred to as everything, including the kitchen sink. So let's start with that. Do you use the term soft skills, and either why or why not?
That's a great first question. I think I'm of two minds. We would definitely use the term soft skills. We use terms like emotional intelligence, but I think soft skills in particular, they feel controversial to those that I find really value them because there's an immediate defensiveness. You say soft skills, you're like, no, they're hard skills. They're important skills. They're incredibly valuable. And so I think similarly, I have a toy company. We're called 21 Toys. We have an empathy toy and a failure toy. And almost always when especially because we design them for ages 6 to CEO. So once we kind of get more to the words of the adults, every adult comes up to me and they're like, well, it's not really a toy. It's a tool. They need it to have this more depth and weight. And for right or wrong, we've chosen the much harder challenge of saying like, no, toys are just as important and serious. And so I think going back to soft has this connotation that it's not as important. Whereas being soft, malleable, agile, and, creative and
Right.
aware of your emotions is certainly the most important skills if we're looking at, the skills that we need for today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And if anything, there's been a real resurrection in this post-pandemic era of what's historically been referred to as soft skills. I think that, in fact, I know that part of our commitment, and I echo your experience of being of two minds. I'm not married to the term soft skills, but I'm unwilling to give up this idea of a binary soft, hard relationship, and that there's this necessarily less than understanding. I think it's dusty and archaic and doesn't make any more sense. And it may have at one point, right? You'll hear some people refer to soft skills as originating in the U.S. Army. Have you heard anything about that?
I haven't. No.
Yeah, there's this, I can't remember the exact source, but it's something about soft skills being introduced within the military in the U.S., which I say with a lot of hesitation because many things can be attributed to the military in the U.S.
Right.
So I cannot claim that I'm 100% certain, but I have heard this either myth or fact several times that soft skills was a term introduced at some point by the U.S. military to distinguish exactly what you had suggested, the technical or the hard skills versus everything else. And if that is a true origin story, I don't believe that the dichotomy still makes sense, right? I don't think it does.
Yeah. That's such a fascinating, if that is kind of where it originated, it's fascinating because that's reflective of the perceived value from that community, where they're the most important skills. And so of course the softer skills could be perceived as, weak and not as strong. Whereas anyone that's I believe being in any sort of a team, whether it's sports or, if you're in combat, the ability to connect with your teammates and your colleagues and to really understand where they're going and to motivate each other. It's all that invisible stuff. That's really the most important. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. 20, many years ago, when I first became active in teaching and coaching around soft skills, I actually had more than one person ask me if I was referring to aesthetics, such as hairdressing or nails. And
wow,
that's still stuck with me.
Yeah.
Good, bad, or neutral. I'm not suggesting hair and aesthetics are not important. However, I'm not skilled in that regard whatsoever. But it was an interesting association to find myself in alignment with suddenly, right? Nonetheless. So let's move on to another question, as I know that there's so much that we can pick your brain about. So one of the popular questions that we have amongst our buffet approach in this questionnaire that we've had feedback on is this one. And it is, what does success leading others look like to you? What does success leading others look like to you?
It's such a layered question. And I also think when I started, I relate it to when I started my business. So my background is industrial design. So the Empathy Toys, my thesis project in university, I was trained to approach every situation from the lens of design thinking. And design thinking actually starts with empathy. It's empathic research. It's really not finding the right solution. It's about finding the right problem. And so to do that, you really need to fully understand holistically, like the situation and really, understand environments and how folks relate to each other. And I think with the way that I built my business, my assumptions around building a business was, you make a thing, you make sure that not make a thing, like you can create a service or a product or something and make sure that it relates directly to the folks that are using it. And so much of my time and effort with building the business was about making sure that the empathy toy had a home. And by having a home, it was, I think it's going to change education. So I would be meeting with teachers. And then when I found out that there was an opportunity kind of in corporate learning, I started meeting with facilitators. When I never really considered with building my business until I was suddenly thrown into a leadership position was how much of my job was about building a team. And I think one of the challenges, especially for founders, is that the skills that helped you excel at the first stage of your business are now a liability at the second stage. And so what made me great at starting a company was I'm scrappy, I'm resilient, I'm an industrial designer, meaning that we have a very, very large, shallow pool of knowledge. We can figure out how to do everything just well enough, but very few of us are masters or experts in one particular domain. And so I was really good at figuring out how to make the logo and like getting the factory and all of those things. And then when I built a team, me stepping in and doing the work was not only expensive and inefficient, but it was really not helpful to build up the team's success and to make them feel confident in their skills and how they're helping. And so I think the idea of like what has been helpful in my success, I would say, or what I would define as successful in my journey of entrepreneurship is being incredibly agile and resilient and open to the idea that you are going to have to become a completely different person at every stage to enter that new stage. And the fear associated with starting something new and having no idea how it's going to go. And also with entrepreneurship, you're being watched, which is not new for me. So normally you can fail in private, but once you've run a business, your failures are very, very, very public. And so all of that, I think building all of that with the idea that for success, it's really about honoring yourself, your integrity, and your process at every stage, the stage where you are excelling and you're doing really, really well. But that first day on the job where it's your business, but it's your first day leading a team, or it's your first day, taking huge investment and trying to scale and working with like incredibly strong, like senior leaders, it requires a completely different approach and skill set. And so I think for me, I stopped paying attention anymore to how great I was at something the first time I tried it. And instead I paid more attention to how am I present in my body? How grounded am I? And how open am I to learning, and to learning through humility, and curiosity?
There's a lot in that answer there. So thank you for that. I would particularly like to turn a phrase of a large, shallow pool of knowledge. Certainly can empathize with that in my own experience, and having enough knowledge to move many projects forward, but certainly not to see all of them through to fruition. Perhaps in my mind, but not in reality. You mentioned distinguishing between either phase or stage one of a business, especially from an entrepreneurial or startup perspective, from a stage or phase two. Are there any indicators, or are there any examples of that evolution between those phases that you can tell me more about?
Yeah, I would say the first stage of any business is just validation. So really find the right fit for the product and the market, and even just for yourself energetically, where are you in flow?
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll know that you're reaching the end of that stage when, let me see if I can explain this correctly. You've kind of hit a plateau where you can feel you're just not going to jump or get that much more traction. Like you start to see repeat patterns. Some entrepreneurs, I'm not necessarily in the extreme category of this, but some just start to get bored.
Yeah.
Or not even, or bored, or they're just, sorry, I shouldn't actually say bored. It could be bored if it's going well. It could be very, very stressful if you keep pushing, but it's just not getting over that ledge or that hump.
By extension, then, could it be comfortable and where someone wants to reside permanently?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it depends. I've discovered that when I talk about entrepreneurship, my lens is so specific to having a team, but designing and building a product and putting it into the world very differently than like a service-based business, where with service-based, you can kind of experiment a bit more, and you can typically sell things before they exist, if that makes any sense.
Oh, I do know what that means.
I did that, but much more boldly.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I have an idea. With the empathy toy, I have a few prototypes. And when folks expressed interest, I said, great, you can either get on my wait list, or sometimes I was as bold as to say you can pre-order. It'll be ready in about a year. And so mine was much less about comfort and more about the discomfort of not being able to get past that leap. I think I got my first order of 30 empathy toys from a school board that had heard about me on Twitter through another teacher who'd recommended the toy because they'd seen it at a conference. And then I was quite lucky. I'd given a TEDx talk on the origin story of how I invented it. And so the school kind of saw that and then fell in love with it, called me and put in an order. And at the time I had 8 working prototypes. I was sleeping on my best friend's couch. And I was just using, an artist grant to pay for, websites and things. And when they put in the order, I was like, well, I know how much it costs me to make this toy. And I know that there's like that ratio that you duplicate, you multiply the cost of goods to the price with, but that would have been far too high. So I just kind of gave them a number, and then they said, what if we bought 30? And I said, great. And that's when I got my first order, and it was 5 figures. And so I was able to turn that into a mini mass production run where I got 100 sets made, but it wasn't enough. It was just enough to get me so stressed about delivering, my first production run and finding the right factory and finding the right,
that was definitely
collaborators.
Phase 2, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Sorry?
That was definitely stage 2 or phase 2, no longer in flow?
No longer in flow. No, actually, it was really interesting. I found that I was in a lot more in flow in the early years. Oh. Even in the frustration, I was in flow. So for example, I think I paid a consultancy, I don't know, $500 to help me figure out how to make the toy from plastic to wood. Because I was like, I'm an industrial designer, but I'm not like an expert in mass productions of wood. I got in an agency and they went from being very confident. They're like, oh, this is no problem, to a week later being like, this is absolutely impossible. And I think the flow I was in was I really trusted my intuition, and I didn't let that bring me down. I just said, oh, they just don't know how to make it out of wood. I'll still figure it out. And I was quite shameless, I would say, the first few years. I knocked on every single door of every wooden shop that there was in downtown Toronto until I found a factory that would say yes. I would say when I got out of flow, was definitely over the years of being further actually pushed away from my intuition, because there were more and more voices suddenly in my business and also in my designs. And so I've actually been on a very long journey of getting that back. But definitely the phase, for me, the shift was, we were just making enough orders. We were just getting enough toys that I couldn't build the team that I wanted. I couldn't invest the time that I needed to get it to that next level. So that was when we decided to, I decided to put it on Kickstarter. And then that's how we got in our first, over 300 orders, which suddenly didn't just give us a cash injection, because they were all pre-orders. So I wasn't, designing while trying to figure out how to fund it. But I was suddenly able to work with writers, bring other designers, and so that really made a huge difference into creating the really deep guidebooks and learning materials that accompanied the toys.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Another question that our listeners are often interested in is actually one of my favorite as well, and it is, how do you define confidence? It often inspires sort of those guttural noises. It's a good question, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah, I think I always go back to this because the design process is similar to this. And I will always remember this lesson. It was this man from Cambridge University who teaches the business course there. And he was describing innovation as being able to hold two truths, like one truth in each hand, that are contradictory to each other. And so I feel the same way about confidence, which is confidence is strength, certainty, determination. You have a very solid understanding of your perception of something. And at the same time, you are very open to a different perspective. And similarly, I think with innovation or design, I always like to say, when you're inventing something, you're starting a business, you need to be humble and open and curious and really looking for feedback. And it's at the exact same time, you internally know exactly what you're looking for. You know what's right and wrong for you. And so those might seem like completely opposite perspectives, but it's in the ways that those two kind of, that the friction and the tension that is created by that opposition, that to me is confidence. And so I think with my instincts with the empathy toy, but even the failure toy, I said I was designing a failure toy. Similarly with the improv toy, I didn't know how it worked. I had no idea. I said, I want to design a toy that teaches failure. And people say, how does it work? I don't know. I have to start working on it. And so I think it's that like interesting balance of having really clear set intentions and kind of that very strong knowing. But at the same time, being very not being closed-minded in that approach, being a lot more open-minded.
There's plenty to dig into there. I'm curious because I can honestly say I haven't had this cognitive dissonance that you described, that the two truths being held simultaneously while maybe if some contradiction. I haven't had cognitive dissonance introduced in looking at confidence or trying to define it before. However, I think it's a really interesting idea because there is a lot of work that I do that might be in parallel to some of what you have said, in that oftentimes we look at confidence as an example of a feeling, and as celebratory or as perhaps reductive as it may sound, we have plenty of feelings: happy, sleepy, dopey, grumpy, just to name a few. And the idea of appearing confident versus feeling confident, that in itself can be an enormous space to play around in. However, if one is feeling an absence of confidence, and I've not yet figured out what the opposite of it really is, it does not mean that one is paralyzed, that we don't necessarily act at the same time. So maybe there's a behavioral dissonance that I spend time around asking people to recognize that perhaps they don't have that certainty that you speak of, and yet they are behaving as if they do at the same time. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I actually think it's interesting, because I think when you don't have confidence, but there's a confidence in doing something that you're not confident about, if that makes any sense. So there's like a performative aspect to it.
Absolutely.
But that in itself has its own confidence. I think it's interesting though. When I think of confidence, I think like of this like deep groundedness, but then the bravery in getting on a stage, and singing to a group of strangers when your internal dialogue is telling you not to. But I also think that for me, the performative aspect of it is kind of what gets you on the stage. Right. When you start singing and you realize this isn't so scary, or you feel proud of yourself, it's interesting because you can, I do think that you can sense that person's confidence growing in that moment. And you're able to see that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some of that is the acceptance of feedback. Right? So being able to understand one's own behavior through how it's perceived by others. And that performative aspect that you speak of, it can be reduced to, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective on marketing, to Nike, just do it. And it can be that it is in even the smallest act of what is self-defined as perhaps brave, or, affording one the opportunity for some discomfort, or whether right or wrong, right? That's all within that individual. That if one still moves forward externally with some behavioral choice, whether it's, wearing a different sock from their other sock that day, or whether it's speaking at a meeting, or, hopefully safely jumping out of an airplane with a professional and all that. But it needs to be an act outside of self for there to be some feedback. And maybe it's in that the performative aspect that some of that cognitive dissonance, it's not solved. It's perhaps, some of the meta thinking that we need to do of thinking about our own thinking. Maybe it's looking at those two truths, and maybe disqualifying both of them for a second. I don't know.
Disqualifying, or I would say, I think where I find that magic lies is in that tension and in that friction, like letting things be opposing, letting them butt heads, and figuring, for me, it's very abstract, but like when I talk about designing a toy, or a game, the metaphor that I use is I am creating tension, right? I want to make people just uncomfortable enough that they're laughing and not hating, but not hating me or being wildly bored. And so with anything, like if you think of music, it's like you're creating a tension to create a certain type of reaction or frequency, or creating some sort of an emotion. So for me, it's less about melding or removing. It's about actually creating healthy tensions so that those kind of things come up.
So hanging out in that space, maybe between on the spectrum. I think that even in my mind goes back to our original question about hard versus soft skills. There is a tension there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I certainly like standing on that tension. I can understand that analogy. So here's a piece that I think will bring our conversation quite organically to extend on some of the themes you've already introduced. And it's a question that asks, what have you done or seen during your career that develops a person's professional presence?
When you say professional presence, you mean how they present, how they speak, how they how they present themselves to their colleagues.
That's absolutely a way of looking at it. Yes.
Okay. I think so. I'll keep bringing it back kind of as a little anecdotal story. So when I first went into industrial design, so I went to school at Carleton University and I came from Winnipeg.
Mm-hmm.
And this was my first time living out of home. And in my school, I was quite strong in sciences, but I was equally strong in art. And my artistic practice was mostly just, drawing with pencil. And I had a very supportive art teacher and I really loved it. And then I got to Carleton in Ottawa. In the first 5 minutes of our class, our teacher said, okay, we're all going to go outside. Everyone's going to draw what they see. And then we're going to put your drawings up on the wall. And I was like, what? I've been here 5 minutes. This is terrifying. All strangers. I'm 17, I think, at the time. And so we do the drawing, we put it up, and then he takes out a red pen and he goes, this is my famous red pen. And he starts destroying every single sketch, saying, this is wrong, this isn't that. And it was like he committed a crime. I was like, I had an art teacher. I went to high school art class, like everything was precious. And he just destroyed all of that. And it was really, really difficult. But the lesson that he was trying to teach us was like, this is not going to be precious. This is going to be messy and I'm going to be brutal. And I am going to, speak very directly to you. And I think I wouldn't want that experience for others. I think there's a way that they could have done that wasn't so shocking.
Yes.
But I do think this idea of getting over that hurdle of where things are really precious and things are very too young and I can't show that to anyone, is you really miss the opportunity to be messy in front of other people and to bring them in on your journey and to see them be messy. And so I think for me, the way that you can present really well is maybe even going back to that confidence thing, really put your best foot forward, prepare, consider, but until you are actively doing something, you're not going to learn how you react to that. And so being too precious with things, is definitely can stop you from just, getting on the stage and learning. I've learned a lot over the years. And actually some of the jobs that I've had in the lead up to starting 21 Toys have been quite funny. For a time I was a karaoke DJ. And that's actually how I paid for toy prototypes. And it was this really interesting thing that I saw where people did not want to get on stage. They were so nervous and so embarrassed. But if you just got them the right song, you would just kind of pick a song they really liked. They couldn't help themselves. They'd get on stage, they'd start singing. And instead of being embarrassed and leaving, they're just so happy to be singing their favorite song that they will not get off stage. And then they're asking, suddenly can I do this song, that song? And so I think that finding that place of flow and finding that place of confidence and really all of that is find out when you feel safe or comfortable enough to start being messy in public. And you are going to develop exponentially. It's such a beautiful space to be in when you're ready for it.
And a beautiful turn of phrase, messy in front of others. I'm going to keep that one if I may. So in being aware of one's preciousness and, vulnerability comes in so many shapes, sizes, dimensions, orientations, changes on the moment. I would suggest from one moment to the next, from one person to the next, what we are aware of in terms of our self-awareness as to what we feel vulnerability about. I think sometimes we're not even aware until we are provided some sort of feedback, and that feedback comes when we are either intentionally or unintentionally messy in front of others. Is that fair in extending what you've offered so far?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would include things like when you start, the older you get, you start to find patterns. And the gift of those patterns is to highlight what you might subconsciously be avoiding or missing. And so being vulnerable and being around other folks that are emotionally intelligent that can maybe be a mirror for you is really, really, really quite important. But vulnerability is really, really hard.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And I've spent a lot of time teaching of late in and around the idea of patterns, actually. So it's a word that's really at the forefront of some of my thinking. And from an organizational behavior perspective, some of the latest thinking is that a pattern, well, means twice. And that's a very small number. That's just one above one. I like to point out to people.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's tolerance in there.
There's two of those. So yeah. If a pattern is constituted by two other utterances or instances or incidents, and it is considered, I think rightfully at times, a very small number, it means the opportunity for perhaps more immediate and or relevant feedback needs to come pretty gosh darn early within a pattern. And so there's that to consider. But then the other piece I'm asking perhaps more so for your thinking on is, you mentioned having emotionally intelligent others in front of whom you can be messy. Some of us are amongst emotionally underintelligent others. How do we bear that?
Oh, I mean, what I would say, so I'll speak a little bit to this. So I think if you speak to really any entrepreneur or anyone that really is doing something that is just so much larger than them, that requires so much resilience, and you are being, watched. I have definitely discovered that most entrepreneurs, their business will at some point inevitably really highlight all the aspects of themselves, including the ones that they haven't confronted, the ones that they didn't consider. And so it is brutal work. But the patterns that you're shown, it's not just twice. You're shown those patterns, multiple times. And a lot of the times they can actually really quite escalate. So personally, I've had a pattern that I really had thought I'd gotten rid of from childhood. And because I moved and I started this business, and I was like, I'm very resilient. I'm great at being resilient. Unfortunately, being resilient, the shadow of that for me was that there were some things that I had carried and I continue to carry from childhood that weren't serving me and weren't good or healthy. But I just kind of, instead of confronting them and, trying to really better unpack them, I just thought, well, no, I got over that. I'm okay. And then in my business over the course of these number of years, the pattern would reemerge with different people that I would somehow end up having close to me in my life. And I would say, how does this keep happening? How do I keep introducing these? How do I keep essentially being manipulated, being confronted with this idea that I thought that I knew someone and I didn't? And I've had over the years it go from mild to actually quite severe, to most recently actually having something quite severe happen at the end of 2022. And it was so difficult and traumatic that it forced me to confront it and say, okay, what have I been ignoring? And a big thing that I've learned is I'm very comfortable being quite open with most people. That's just kind of how I've always lived. I actually think that's how I maybe got through my early years, was because I wasn't, I just told people where I was at because I needed help. And one of the things about vulnerability is it's so key and it's so important to building safety and security and to bring other people with you. But your vulnerability can also be used as a weapon against you. And if you're not consciously aware of who you're letting into your life or who you're having in your life, and you don't have that support system around you to also mirror that to you, that might not be right for you. That might be dangerous. That pattern will repeat. And so my pattern has been that my vulnerability is actually sometimes can be used, really as a weapon to manipulate. And so I really, really respect the work of like Brene Brown and other thought leaders who say, you can be kind, you can be open, you can be vulnerable, but you have to have really good boundaries. And you also have to have a lot of inner knowing. And so I think if you're surrounded with really highly emotionally intelligent people, that's great. And that's safety. But at the end of the day, you're going to encounter folks that maybe don't have that or aren't living as consciously, or the worst case might actually be there for not good or healthy reasons. And the work that I've been doing, and I continue, I'm very much on that path, is just to get really grounded in your inner knowing and really understand who can I give that vulnerability to, or how vulnerable can I show up in this space, right. And how can I honor myself in that. So I think, like anything, you get so much from being vulnerable with the right people in that right community, and I've had so many gifts in my life because of that. But in that same breath, I've become a bit more discerning with who I give that vulnerability to.
Certainly. And I appreciate your candor. There's inherent social risk that we often are either under sophisticated or under practiced in articulating in being vulnerable, that I know you highlight really well. An expression that I often have loitering in my thoughts came to the surface in listening to your words just now, which is the expression is growing pains, not growing tickles.
Yeah, I like that.
And run with it. It's helped me. And the selectivity that having self-awareness and inner knowledge can afford one is in how potentially we can develop this other awareness. And that's that other side of the cycle. However, I would suggest to you that self-awareness certainly has been one of the themes in many of the episodes of this podcast by remarkably vicarious and industrious and creative routes. It comes back to, and who am I again?
Wait, who is this?
And who am I now? And who was I then?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And I honestly, from my own, point in my own life cycle, can tell you that I'm pretty much on the verge of my sixth Diana, and have had
congratulations.
Some great ones. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Some were short, some were quite expansive. However, I've done some of that for my own edification and my own education in terms of compartmentalizing. So, that selectivity of with whom it is that we choose to be vulnerable. And at times, many of us don't realize our own preciousness until it is brought to our attention, right? We don't realize. So there's a lot to be said there about this being an ongoing process. And the piece there that I would say as we, wrap up our time together is that if we are seeing ourselves in similar relationships or in being drawn towards similar either personalities or events or lifestyle choices or relationships or any or all of the above, dipping a toe into some of the neuroscience, that reticular activating system, that RAS that we all have, is trying to prove that self-talk that you have to be correct. It's listening. So if you yourself have not been listening, right, the RAS will take over.
Yeah. Well, I was happy. I mean, I was going to say what I've experienced, and it's been about 6 months since that happened. It's been fascinating how, for me, it's so much of my healing journey has been about talking less and feeling, just sitting in that feeling, and things like breath work, working with intuitives and healers, and really just understanding energy has been huge at listening to myself. I would have some, it was quite intense what I went through. And so there were moments where I remember I would wake up and I'd be anxious, and I was like, okay, just push through, go to that meeting, do that thing, do that tour. And then I'm just so anxious, and I was really anxious. And I had a moment in my kitchen where I was like, I was mad at myself for being anxious. And then I had this flip where I looked down, I went my head went down and my eyes went down to my body, and it went, oh, I'm so sorry. And I like held myself and I was like, I'm sorry. Are you stressed out? I'm like, have I been pushing you more than you can go? And I could hear my body say, yeah. And I was like, I'm so sorry. Have I been asking you to do something that you continually am telling me like you're not ready to do? And I just held myself and I was like, I'm so sorry. And I said, what do you need? And then I was like, do you want to go for a walk? I could feel my body being like, yes. And I was like, do you want me to call someone to talk about our feelings while we're going on that walk? Or do you want to like listen to music? And it was like, I want to listen to music. I was like, okay. And I like literally took care of myself. Because I think so often in the way that we exist, but definitely, being a woman, my relationship that was severed. And I think when you go through these kinds of experiences, the relationship that was the most severed was the one between my head and my body. Certainly. And it's not that instead of saying my head doesn't trust my body, it's my body doesn't trust my head. My body is saying, you've made these decisions that have not been good for me. And so I actually don't know if I can trust you. And that's a wonderful way for anyone to come in. If they break that bond, that kills your connection to your intuition. And so all of the work that I've been doing right now is so much of it is, and I'm on that journey of like somatic work to talk to my intuition again, to build that connection, to build that trust between my body and my head. And I think we all kind of go through different versions of that journey through our lives. But it's been incredible. And I think the biggest thing for me is I'm a designer. I think of myself as creative and artistic. But when I think about business, it's hard to think of it being a creative or artistic act. Every single entrepreneur I know that I am so impressed with that has built so many things, they have the strongest intuition. They are actually very, very connected with their energy, and they understand how energy is incredibly important into how they exist in the world, and an understanding of their emotions and letting emotions flow and really feeling a feeling and not intellectualizing it. I wish that they had taught those classes, even just 101, Intuition 101, when I first started my business.
We could because call for it me, soft skills 101, right? We could
exactly. Yeah. And it's like, it's not just this side thing. It's actually everything.
I agree with you. And the tension, that the theme there around another example of tension or the push and pull that you described certainly has been one throughout our time together in this episode. And I think that's an important theme to acknowledge, because there is value in recognizing what might be on either side of that spectrum, and that there is indeed a spectrum, and that there's space between what can be extreme, but that also that tension is mitigated by how it is that we are navigating what might be our immediate circumstances or our skills around our self-awareness or self-nurturance, and indeed how that translates to other awareness and other nurturance, if I may. There's so much to be said, and I want to end our time together by going back to one of your original turns of phrase, which is having a large, shallow pool of knowledge. I feel like our pool has had new depths, and that certainly my knowledge has expanded in speaking with you. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, Ilana.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening to another dynamic and informative episode of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Please consider subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we also encourage you to visit our website and social media links, which you can find in the show's notes. We look forward to bringing you another episode. And remember, conversation is the currency of communication. Bye for now.